James Thompson. I'm the director of the Garfield Center for Public Leadership, and I am delighted to have you here with us today to talk about the world state. Now, if I start out right off the bat referencing, say, the WTO. First of all, what is the WTO? Maybe one of our students can tell us. World Trade Organization. And can someone specifically maybe raise your hand, volunteer? Tell us, what does the World Trade Organization do? Nobody. No one whatsoever. World Trade Organization monitors international trade. It regulates it. How many countries are in the WTO? Take a guess. Okay, so 222 is a little high. There are 190 countries. But that is a very ambitious guess, and I respect that. That's not bad. There are 159 out of 190 countries are in the WTO. If the United States is brought before the WTO by another country over a trade dispute, and the WTO finds against the United States, will the United States follow the ruling of the WTO? Yeah, it will. Another interesting fact, where is the WTO located? Switzerland, yeah, it's in Geneva, which is to say that an organization that is not in this country that has 155 members can tell the United States what to do. And it's growing all the time. Here's another fun fact. What was the name of the WTO before it was the WTO? Yeah, it's the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And who created the GATT? The United States. So the United States created an organization that then evolved into this large, powerful international entity that is not based in the United States, that issues rulings that affect American policy, both international and domestic. It's an interesting point. Take another example, the European Union. How many countries are in the European Union? 33? 28. It's not a bad guess. Started with 6 back in the 1950s. It has grown substantially. What was the policy the process was originally meant to address? Does anybody know? German reintegration to Europe was the ultimate goal. The key policy it was addressing was simply the trade between coal and steel. Now, the European Union has 22 more members, and it addresses every imaginable policy a country could have. That is a growing phenomenon. And guess what country has been one of the most consistent supporters of European integration? The United States. The United States right now is initiating a massive trade agreement with the European Union. When that comes into being, it will impact U.S. policy, both domestic and foreign. And the United States is allowing that and, in fact, encouraging that to happen. Take another more close-to-home example. This year, 2014, is the 20th anniversary of what? Creation of what international organization? Starts with an N, ends with an A. NAFTA, right, North American Free Trade Agreement. It was established in 1994. If you want to understand anything about U.S. immigration policy, if you want to understand anything about the profile of Northeast Ohio and its economic growth and decline, if you want to understand a whole lot of things, you have to understand the NAFTA agreement. Again, another example of the United States creating this entity that then impacts American policy. And I could go on and on and on. The U.S. is establishing a free trade agreement in Asia. And it's not just trade agreements. We could look at the NATO alliance. NATO started with 12 members. It now has 28. It was set up to establish security in Europe. It's now pulling out of Afghanistan, where it's been for years. And if you look at all of these entities, what you see is the U.S. creating them, but then those entities impacting back on American policy. What you also see is all of those entities, all these poster childs of globalization, growing and growing and growing. They're becoming more complex. They're getting bigger in terms of membership. And you don't have to be a genius. You don't even have to think about this for more than about 5 seconds to realize there is a logical endpoint towards which all that is pointing. You might not like it, and we might not get there, but the fact is the logic points towards some sort of global state structure. What does that all mean? That means if we want to understand the most salient issues of American public policy, we need to understand the ultimate context in which they're taking place, and that context is pointing towards a world state. The Garfield Center for Public Leadership examines issues of public policy, but we do so at a very deep level. That's why we're talking about this today. And that's why we brought our guests here today to join us to engage in a really interesting conversation. To my immediate left is Professor Alexander Wendt from The Ohio State University. And to his left is Professor Timothy Burns from The Baylor University. And they are here today to discuss the world state. We're going to have one of our students come up here in a second and introduce them to you in a full fashion. You'll realize how lucky we are to have them as guests. Before we do that, just a couple of things. I'd like to recognize a couple people in the audience. The first person I'd like to recognize and express gratitude towards is our president, Tom Chema, who's here with us today. He's always been a champion of the Garfield program. This is actually the last Garfield seminar he will sit in as the president of the college. But we know, we hope, and therefore we know, that he will stay within the Garfield community in a very close way, even once he's off doing many other adventures. So thank you for being here today. Likewise, I would like to recognize the gentleman sitting directly to his left, Mr. Bill Recker. Bill Recker is the patron saint of the Garfield program. He makes so much of what we do possible. We're always grateful, and we're particularly pleased to have him here with us this evening. So thank you, Bill. And finally, especially tonight, I want to recognize my friend and colleague, Professor John Kortansky. We have a present for John Kortansky, and Kathy's going to bring it to him, and that way he can unwrap it as I talk to you about him. Thank you, Kathy. As many of you know, John Kortansky served as the head of the Garfield program for the last 7 years. And in that capacity, he has instilled tremendous strength. He's endowed this program with tremendous strength. And it's strength of a particular type. That is to say, it's strength based on a recognition that if you really want to understand public policy, which is what we're about, you need to get into issues of political philosophy. If you want to do more than just scratch the surface, you've got to get philosophical. John has always made that central to what our mission is here today. The result is that this program isn't just another current affairs talk shop. It's something much better than that, something far more rare. And so, first of all, as a gift, we thought we would get him a book of political philosophy, because that's only appropriate. It so happens it's a book edited by his teacher, the great Leo Strauss, under whom John studied at Chicago. It's a history of political philosophy. John has owned multiple copies of this book, and he doesn't have any of them now, except now the one we gave him. And there's a very specific reason, and that is because he is a kind man, and he loans them to students. As a result, he has not been able to retain them. So, as he will specifically see when he opens to the title page, we've all signed it, and we've also said you are not allowed to loan this to any students. The other thing I'd like us to do right now, it's completely inadequate, but it's also, I think, utterly appropriate, to take a long moment and give him a very rousing round of applause. Thank you, John. Okay, Mr. Tyler Thomas is going to come on up here and give proper introductions. After that, we're going to have Professor Wendt talk for about 30 minutes, Professor Burns for about that amount of time, and then we'll have question and answers. So without further ado, thank you, Tyler.
I'd like to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. Today we will host a discussion on a pressingly important issue, the direction of global politics and the possibility of a global state. Our two guests are each distinguished scholars on this topic and will hopefully provide us with both light and heat on this cold Northeast Ohio day. Dr. Alexander Wendt is the Ralph D. Meerschaum Professor of International Security and Professor of Political Science at The Ohio State University. He is, I can say this without any hint of embellishment, the most preeminent international relations scholar alive today. In 1992, Dr. Wendt published a highly influential journal article entitled "Anarchy is What States Make of It, the Social Construction of Power Politics," where he laid out an alternative theory on state behavior to the dominant neo-realist and liberal theories which then held sway. Rather than a Hobbesian realm, where state behavior is driven by the brutal facts of anarchy, he put forth the provocative notion that relations between states are driven instead by ideas. That is to say, the way states conceive of themselves and their fellow states matters more than any structural characteristic of the international system. Anarchy thus does not describe to states how they must behave, but instead allows for a range of behaviors depending upon social and historical context. In 1999, Dr. Wendt published his first book, Social Theory of International Politics, which expanded upon the ideas contained in Anarchy as what states make of it. The International Studies Association has since named Social Theory of International Politics the best book of the decade. In 2003, Dr. Wendt turned his attention to a new topic, the one that brings us here today, the possibility of a global state. He published a journal article entitled Why World State is Inevitable, which set forth the argument that we are inexorably headed towards a global government for reasons that we will soon hear directly from his own mouth. He is currently working on a project relating quantum physics to international relations. Dr. Timothy Burns is professor of political science at Baylor University, or the Baylor University. He is the author of two books, the recently published Shakespeare's Political Wisdom, and along with co-author Thomas Pangle, the forthcoming Introduction to Political Philosophy. He is also the translator of Marcellinus's Life of Thucydides and editor of Recovering Reason, Essays in Honor of Thomas L. Pangle. Most relevant to our presence here today, Dr. Burns is the compiler and editor of a 1994 volume entitled After History, Francis Fukuyama and His Critics. Francis Fukuyama's end of history thesis is the extraordinarily famous notion that the triumph of the United States over the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War signaled something momentous. The end of history as a battleground of competing ideas and beliefs. Liberal democratic capitalism was announced the victor by Fukuyama over all alternate forms of government and social organization. Fukuyama's thesis was warmly embraced by many hopeful commenters and less warmly embraced by other more critical minds. The volume edited by Dr. Burns belongs to the latter category. After history applies, to borrow Harvey V. Mansfield's phrase, a thorough scrubbing of Fukuyama's interpretation of events. In particular, Dr. Burns drew attention to the questionable fusion of philosophies employed by Fukuyama, Hegelian historicism, Nietzschean nihilism, and Enlightenment rationalism. What Fukuyama had produced, Dr. Burns discovered, was an irresponsible melding of philosophers who were actually deeply disagreeing with one another. When this institute contacted Fukuyama about a potential seminar on the end of history thesis, he responded that he, and I quote, was no longer interested in discussing the topic further. Well done, Dr. Burns. And so now we turn to a related albeit more mature handling of the topic. Dr. Wendt will begin the discussion with an overview of his position that a global state is both achievable and desirable. Dr. Burns will then respond and provide reasons to doubt both the imminence and the desirability of a global state. We will then have time for questions from the Garfield scholars and the audience at large. Please join me in welcoming both Dr. Wendt and Dr. Burns.
Well, thank you, Tyler, for that very generous introduction, to James for inviting me, and to all of you for coming, excuse me, and also to Tim Burns for sharing the podium with me. I very much look forward to his own take on this issue, and of course to all of your reactions as well. My talk builds on this paper that Tyler mentioned that I published over 10 years ago about why I think a world state is inevitable. My original plan was to turn that paper into a book in short order, but then I got interested in a totally different project on this idea of a quantum social science. And with the years it took to write that book, have 2 kids, and just life in general, I'm only now coming back to the world state idea. So this seminar is actually a good timing for me. However, in retrospect, I think it's a good thing that I waited, because unlike the situation in 2003, there is now quite a bit of scholarship on the idea of a world state, which I can take advantage of, and because my own thinking on the subject has come some distance from then as well. In particular, in my 2003 paper, my approach and ambition was purely explanatory. I wanted to show that for good social science reasons, a world state was inevitable whether we liked it or not. Now, I still agree that a world state's inevitable, but I now think that making the case for the desirability of a world state a moral or normative question is essential to the explanatory story. So what I propose to do in my talk today is first briefly define what I mean by a world state, then summarize in about 10 minutes the explanatory argument I made back in 2003, and then highlighting why I think a normative argument is now crucial. And then in the second half of the talk, turning to that normative story about why a world state is desirable or even morally necessary. Okay, so definition. What you think about a world state will depend a lot on what exactly you mean by the term state. And there are a lot of definitions of the state out there in the literature, and they have quite different implications for both the likelihood and desirability of a world state. My own feeling in scholarly work is that arguments are more interesting if you make things hard for yourself, rather than taking easy cases. So with that in mind, I've chosen what I think is a hard case, or a hard definition, which combines elements from Max Weber and Carl Schmitt. From Weber, I take the idea that the essence of the state, any state, is a monopoly on the legitimate use of organized violence. This is a very common view of the state, especially in my own field of international relations, and it also underlies everyday language. The reason we say that Somalia is a failed state is because it does not currently have a monopoly of force in its territory. From Schmitt, in turn, I take a particular view of what it means for a state to have sovereignty. Namely, in quoting Schmitt, he is sovereign who decides the exception. What Schmitt is getting at here is that everyday politics is governed by rules and institutions, like the US Constitution, Congress, and so on. But the Constitution is not where US sovereignty ultimately lies. Where sovereignty lies is with the actors who decide what must be done when the rules and institutions do not provide a clear answer, the exception to the rule rather than the norm. This could vary depending on what issue you're talking about, but when it comes to decisions to use force, namely the issue of organized violence, to kill, the sovereignty lies in the executive branch. In particular, given my Weberian view of the state, sovereignty lies in the ability to decide who is an enemy of the state, whether internal or external, and therefore may be killed by the armed forces. Now, in today's world, sovereignty in this sense is distributed to 190 separate states. It's basically privatized, in effect, on a global scale. Each of these states has the final authority to make life and death decisions about its own national security. Put more provocatively, each state today has a unilateral right to kill foreigners if it thinks this is necessary for its national security, and there's no higher accountability for those decisions. A world state, therefore, would on this view mean that sovereignty over organized violence is collectivized to the whole system. All organized killing would ultimately be accountable to the global sovereign, perhaps a beefed-up UN or something like that, rather than privatized out to 190 separate units. Now, to minimize the alarm that such an idea might raise, just off the top of your head, let me add two qualifications. First, I'm only talking here about sovereignty over violence, not over education policy, taxation, culture, or the vast majority of things that governments do on a day-to-day basis. All of those issues might remain privatized to separate countries. And as such, a world state, on my view, might be a quite minimalist entity focusing just on the issue of violence, and in that sense, not a gigantic bureaucracy, the kind of territorial states we have today. Second, even in the area of organized violence, a world state might be quite decentralized in practice, with each current state retaining its own armed forces. Much like in the United States, each of the 50 states has its own state, local police forces, National Guard, and so on. Now, of course, it might help to have a UN army, but I don't see this as essential to the idea of a world state. All that is essential is that the authority to use violence and the power to back up that authority no longer be a private unilateral right of today's 190 states, but a collective right of the whole. So no national level violence without UN authorization might be kind of a slogan. Even with these qualifications, however, I still think this conceptualization of a world state is a hard case for a theory of world state formation. And the reason is that of all the aspects of a state's sovereignty, control over decisions to use force, over national security, is the aspect that states seem to be least willing to give up. Look at the European Union. Its members have already given up a lot of sovereignty over many different issue areas to the EU level. But control over their armed forces and national security is the one area where this delegation of sovereignty to the EU has progressed least far. And certainly I think this is the area of our own sovereignty that Americans would be most loath to give up as well. Giving up sovereignty to the WTO is one thing, sovereignty over our national security is quite another. But giving it up, I now want to suggest, is inevitable. The argument has both an explanatory component and now in my new iteration, a moral or normative one. Since I already addressed the former in my 2003 paper, I want to get to the latter as quickly as I can in my talk, but the limits of the explanatory argument are important for setting up the normative argument. So let me briefly summarize my 2000 paper first. So the explanatory argument. The basic idea here is that a world state is the only stable equilibrium in global politics, and that until that equilibrium is reached, in other words, as long as the international system remains in anarchy, like it is today, the system will be in disequilibrium and will therefore gradually evolve toward an equilibrium state. This evolution need not be linear. It could be 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But eventually the international system will get there to a world state. How long? Who knows? I give it 100 or 200 years, but nothing rides on that particular prediction. So whereas the dominant realist view of anarchy is that it tends to produce a balance of power among rival states, I'm arguing that the logic of anarchy is to produce a world state. Now, before unpacking that argument a bit more, lest you think it's a hopelessly utopian idea, let me briefly offer 3 pieces of evidence that the system is indeed moving in that direction. The first is the tremendous decrease historically in the number of independent political units or states that exist in the system. It has been estimated that 5,000 years ago, there were 600,000 independent political entities in the world, in effect states. Most of these were tribes and so on, but let's just call them states. Today, there are less than 200. This represents a massive consolidation or concentration of political authority and organized violence potential in the system. So to make an anti-world state argument, you would have to argue that this process of consolidation will eventually stop, perhaps when 2 states are left, and then they can balance each other into eternity. And I don't think that seems very plausible. Now, admittedly, the number of states in the system has gone up since World War II. But for reasons that will become apparent, I think this is actually evidence for my argument and not against it. The second piece of evidence is the consolidation of the European Union. Tremendous economic integration among former enemies, no less, and now they even have one currency. Granted, political and military integration has gone much less far, but with recent moves toward a common foreign and security policy, European defense identity, and so on, the EU now looks set to begin further consolidation even in the security domain in the near future. And that could be a model for other regions as well. And the third evidence is the growing use of UN authorization for uses of force. The idea being that when great powers want to use force, increasingly since the end of the Cold War, they've turned to the UN to legitimize that force and to authorize it. The Gulf War, Bosnia, Libya, and so on. Now, it's not every case of great power uses of force has involved the UN. Think Kosovo or the Iraq War and so on. But I think there is a tendency to use the UN to authorize force, and this, I think, is an embryo of the kind of collective authority over violence that is required by a world state. So all 3 of these trends, I think, are suggestive of a direction to history, but they do not constitute an argument about inevitability. For that, I've got a 2-part story here, one emphasizing material factors and one emphasizing ideas. So the materialist argument is that over time, the cost of war between relatively equal states tends to rise, such that today, major interstate war is now almost impossible. This is so for 2 reasons. First, economic interdependence. We call this the liberal argument. The idea here is the familiar one that as capitalism expands onto the global scale, national economies become more and more interdependent, such that over time it becomes less and less rational for decision makers to contemplate war with each other. Think of China and the US today, much less in 50 years from now. For all our disagreements, both sides know that it would be ruinously costly to our economies to settle those disputes by war. And then the second argument here, call it the realist one, is that it has to do with military competition and technological change. The idea here is that anarchy leads to military competition, and that in turn gives states incentives to invest in new military technology in the hopes of winning wars. States that succeed in war with that new technology will find their new weapons being copied by everybody else in the hopes of also winning future wars. And what the effect of this over time is to ratchet up the overall level of military technology in the system. Now, crucially, advances in military technology usually mean greater destructive power of weapons. And thus, as military technology advances, the costs of war will rise too, at least between equals. Such that today, with nuclear weapons, for the first time, war would be national suicide. So geopolitical competition and anarchy, in effect, makes interstate war impossible. So that's the materialist side of the explanatory argument. The idealist argument is less familiar, but I think it goes back to Hegel. And the starting point here is an assumption about human motivation, and thus the ultimate causes of war. In IR, international relations, we usually assume that what states want is either power, security, or wealth. I agree that states want these things, but following Hegel, I think they also want something else. They want recognition of their identities by significant others. And we want that recognition both as individuals and as groups. And until people get recognition of their identities, they will struggle for it, even till the death. Looking back historically, I think much conflict in world politics is explained by identity/recognition struggles. Think of the 30 Years' War. It's in part about kings fighting for recognition of their right to define the religion of their subjects. And the Peace of Westphalia that ended the 30 Years' War gave us the fundamental institution of modern international society, which is the mutual recognition of state sovereignty and its corresponding doctrine of non-intervention or non-interference. Another example would be the democratic revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries, and then continuing today into the 21st. These are in part about individuals' efforts to get their governments to recognize their right to have democratic control over the power that rules them, to make political power accountable. Or, a less benign example, think about Al-Qaeda's struggle today. It's not about power, security, or wealth. It's about protecting, in their minds, protecting Islamic civilization against the threat of Western encroachment, which is a kind of struggle for recognition. Now, an important consequence of these struggles is that once they are successful, once people feel recognized in their individual and group identities, then violence and war are no longer necessary. Thus, over time, the institution of mutual recognition of sovereignty, of state sovereignty, for example, has helped pacify interstate politics, such that today it is considered completely illegitimate to try to conquer other states, whereas 2 centuries ago, that was just what you did in world politics. Likewise, the spread of democracy and the recognition of individuals' rights have brought us the democratic peace, namely the fact that democratic states almost never go to war with each other because their citizens don't want to die fighting other democrats. Now, in my 2003 paper, I put these material and ideational logics together and tried to show in a very schematic way how they would move international politics in various stages from a world of 600,000 states way back when, living in a Hobbesian war of all against all, to today's world of less than 200 states living in relative peace, what might be called a cosmopolitan peace. To be sure, this peace is not yet universal. There are still authoritarian states out there. Ethnic and civil wars in the Middle East, Africa, and elsewhere clearly indicate that this cosmopolitan peace is not a complete one. But in the global north, the process of liberal democratization and pacification is basically complete. And as struggles for recognition play out further in the global south, I would argue that the latter too will eventually be pacified as well. Now, for many scholars, from Francis Fukuyama today to Kant and Hegel 2 centuries ago, such a pacification would represent the end of history, completing the evolution of the world political system. In effect, in their view, the world will have become America. Okay. Now, importantly, this end state, this cosmopolitan peace, is not a world state by my definition, but a system of states that still retain ultimate sovereignty over the use of violence. They just happen not to want to use that sovereignty to kill anybody, but they retain the right. Okay. So to get to my claim that a world state is inevitable, I need a further argument that takes us from the cosmopolitan peace to a world state. And this is where I think the normative issue comes really into play, that a world state is morally necessary. So let me turn to that argument now. The crux of my argument here is that there is a basic normative contradiction between the principles of liberal democracy, which I've assumed in the cosmopolitan piece will be universalized, on the one hand, and the principles of territorial state sovereignty, as I defined it above. As such, even a system of cosmopolitan peace will still be in disequilibrium or unstable, and thus it will eventually move world politics toward a world state. So to set that up, let me briefly summarize what I'll call the ethics of territorial state sovereignty. And these ethics are essentially communitarian or nationalist, which is to say that communities, territorial communities, have the right to exclude foreigners through citizenship laws and immigration control. And so they basically can define membership in their own communities. So that's one aspect. And the second is that communities, in particular states, have final authority to decide who is an enemy and may therefore be killed. In effect, when it comes to national security at least, every state is the judge of its own case. That's sort of the standard view that we live with today. So if the United States decides that the Iraqi regime is a threat to our national security and we have to invade it, then that's our call in the end, and it is not accountable or answerable to anyone else. Thousands of Iraqis might die as a result, but they have no redress because this is just how things are in a world of territorial states. So now, as an alternative, consider the ethics of liberal democracy when applied to the global scale. And I'll take up liberalism first and then democracy second. Liberalism is a universalistic ideology, the fundamental principle of which is that all human beings have the same basic rights. And the implementation of those rights should not be affected by ascriptive characteristics or accidents of birth. Let me just take two examples. The first is freedom of movement, which is perhaps one of the most basic of these rights. It seems to me that, immigration controls are fundamentally illiberal in character, non-liberal, and we would never tolerate restrictions on the freedom of movement within liberal societies today. So why would such restrictions be justified on a global scale in a world of liberal democracies? Moreover, immigration controls and the citizenship laws that they protect have two important illiberal effects. On the level of individuals, they create tremendous inequality of opportunity, or different life chances, for people born in the US, for example, versus Bangladesh, on the other hand. And they do so purely as a result of an accident of birth. And liberalism, it seems to me, is incompatible with such a fundamental inequality of opportunity. It's a morally arbitrary result. And second, on a collective level, these laws institutionalize inequality between states and thereby help to preserve the wealth of rich societies. As an illustration, consider what would happen if we opened the border with Mexico. Lots of unskilled workers would immigrate to the United States, creating downward pressure on wages in this country. Conversely, in Mexico and elsewhere, with a reduction in the supply of cheap labor, because it's all moving here, you would see the price of labor, namely wage rates, would rise in those countries. And so you would begin to get a gradual convergence in wage rates by opening the border. That doesn't mean you would get total equalization. There are lots of other reasons for inequality between the United States and Mexico, like education and productivity and so on. But it does mean that one reason the US is so rich is that we artificially protect our wealth through the political instrument of citizenship laws and immigration controls that keep out people that would, in a sense, drag our wealth down. And that seems to me is a fundamentally illiberal idea, something that we would never tolerate at home. So that's one example. The other that I want to talk about here is freedom from arbitrary killing. If human beings have any universal right, it's a right to live in peace as long as they're not hurting anybody else, a right to life. In a liberal society, if someone threatens that right, be it an individual or an agent of the state, that is wrong and is not tolerated. So consider again the Iraq War example. By what liberal principle did we have the right to go in there and kill thousands of Iraqis, many of them innocent? Granted, we went in there because we thought we were threatened by Saddam Hussein, and I'm not taking a position on that, okay? And we certainly didn't intend to kill thousands of Iraqis, but that's still cold comfort to those Iraqis and their families. By way of analogy, consider what our attitude would be if there was a zone of heavy gang activity in Cleveland or Columbus where the government had essentially lost control and decided to send in the military to reestablish its authority. And in doing so, the military devastated the neighborhood and killed hundreds of innocent civilians in collateral damage. It seems to me that such an activity would have significant repercussions for those in charge of such an operation and for individual soldiers if they could be identified. In short, collateral damage like that would not be tolerated within a liberal society. In sum, with respect to both freedom of movement and freedom from arbitrary killing, liberalism is inconsistent with the sovereignty of the territorial state. So now let me turn to what I'll call the ethics of democracy. The fundamental principle of democracy is that power should be accountable to those it affects. This is called the principle of affected interests by democratic theorists. Now, usually in democratic theory and practice, we think of this principle as applying only to the citizens of territorial states, within states, to the demos within a state. And historically, that probably made sense. With the big exception of interstate wars, which I'll get to in a minute, historically, the people that were affected by power structures were primarily the state's own citizens. And so it made sense to think of the demos in territorial terms. Today, however, in a globalizing world, it is increasingly difficult to justify such a limited application of the democratic principle. Canadian citizens are deeply and routinely affected by the decisions of the American government. So why shouldn't they have a say in how this form of power over them is exercised? And then, of course, there is still the problem of interstate war. Iraqis were deeply affected by the decision of the U.S. to invade their country and now have no recourse. Why should that exercise of our power not be accountable in some way to the Iraqis? In other words, why should the U.S. be allowed to be judge in its own case? Now, one response to this line of argument is to claim that societies are free associations. And so if a people come together and constitute themselves as a people, as a demos, then that is their right. And democratic principles would then apply only within that society or free association, not outside. But this response, I think, is vulnerable to a basic objection, which is known as the boundary problem in democratic theory. Namely, the idea of a society or demos as a free association already assumes a distinction or a boundary between those who are going to have a vote in constituting that association and those who don't. And the problem is, how is that boundary between us and them, friend and enemy, in Schmittian terms, to be justified in democratic terms? Now, perhaps if a group of people lives on a desert island cut off from all outsiders, then yes, you could argue that those people can constitute themselves as a demos. But in the real world, there are always outsiders out there who will be affected by the power of a democratic free association, and as such might want to be included in the discussion from the start. So how to justify their exclusion from the process right up front? In practice, we do so on grounds of ethnicity, language, or just historical accident, okay? But none of these criteria provide a democratic justification for the boundary. Indeed, quite the contrary. These are anti- or non-democratic bases for the constitution of our demos. In short, I would argue that the only way to constitute a demos that is consistent with democratic theory, at least in today's world, is to do so globally, where everybody on the planet has a say in how the world will be carved up and organized. And then, if people want to go their separate ways, that's fine, but everybody gets to have a say in that process at the start. In sum, taking these liberal and democratic principles together, it seems to me that there is a fundamental contradiction between the principles that we hold dear at the domestic level and the principles of the territorial sovereign state. Putting it another way, if we were designing the organization of the world today from scratch, and assuming that a cosmopolitan peace had already been achieved, we would never, as liberal Democrats, proceed to delegate sovereignty, and especially the right to kill, to 190 separate units. It just doesn't make any sense. So the only reason that we have such a system today is because of history, which is which is not, from a liberal democratic standpoint, a sufficient justification. Now, to wrap up my talk, I want to consider two objections, one normative and one more practical. The normative objection is a very common one to a world state, and I think one of the oldest objections, going back to Kant himself. And that is that a world state would be a despotism, an undemocratic, authoritarian structure that would force its members to do things they don't want to do. This is the world state of black helicopter fame that frightens, I think, many Americans and probably many people around the world. Okay. Yet, while this is a common and politically salient objection, I've had trouble finding serious scholarly arguments to actually try to defend it. It's more often asserted and feared than argued for. And in fact, I think it's a relatively easy objection to deflect for three reasons. First, if a world state does come about, it won't be by force, by some state conquering the world. For all our military superiority as the American state, consider the limits of American power today globally. And if we couldn't take over the world today as sort of the unipole, it's doubtful that anybody else could do so either. It's much more likely, in my view, that a world state will evolve very gradually and voluntarily, much like the European Union is today. And in that process, one can be sure that making sure that it's a democratic process with lots of checks and balances will be a very high priority for today's territorial states. They're not going to sign on to anything voluntarily that gives away democracy at a global level. The second response to this objection is the issue of scale. In large democracies today, the center of power is already very far removed from individual voters. And in a world state of 10 billion people down the road, that distance will only be increased. So even if a world state is not a despotism, it is clear that it will not be the kind of direct democracy that the ancient Athenians enjoyed. On the other hand, India today has a population of over 1 billion people, and those people speak hundreds of languages. And yet it has been a democracy of long standing. It's not a perfect democracy, but no one would say that India is a despotism. So if India can be a democracy, then why could not a world state be one? And finally, consider the alternative to a world state, an anarchic system like today, where territorial states retain the sovereign right to decide the exception and are able to kill foreigners if they so choose. It seems to me, as I've suggested above, that that is actually a despotism, and of the worst kind. So whatever the imperfections of a world state, its accountability to its people will surely be greater than today's states are accountable to foreigners. So that's kind of the response to the normative objection. Now there's a practical objection, which I think also has a normative side to it. And that is that the great powers, and the United States in particular, will probably be very resistant to the idea of a world state, since after all, they have the most to lose. If you're Chad or Burundi, having territorial sovereignty doesn't buy you a whole lot. If you're the US, having territorial sovereignty gives us tremendous freedom of action on the global stage. So why would we want to give that up? And more to the point, who has the power to make us? Okay. Now, I have no doubt that great powers would resist joining a world state, but in the end, I don't see how they can avoid it. For if the rest of the world has become America, so to speak, become a cosmopolitan piece, then on what normative principle can we argue that our sovereignty should remain separate and unaccountable to everyone else? In other words, by what right should we retain final authority to kill Canadians if we unilaterally decide that that's in our national interest? It seems deeply hypocritical and inconsistent with our own values. Now, one might respond that the issue here is not one of by what right, but about the power to resist world state formation. And I concede that nobody can force the US to join. But here, I guess I would return to Hegel's struggle for recognition. For it is not only the slave who seeks recognition from the master, it is also the master who seeks recognition from the slave. And while in the short run, the master can compel the slave to recognize him with the threat of violence or even death, in the long run, this is not satisfying. Coerced recognition is not really recognition at all, but a pale, psychologically unsatisfying substitute. So if Americans really want to be recognized by others, then that recognition has to be freely given, not compelled. And that's only going to happen if we choose to make ourselves vulnerable by joining a world state. Ultimately, in other words, the question is whether we could live with ourselves by not joining with the rest of America, namely the globalized one, in a world state. So as I see it, in the end, Americans will have a choice between their nationalist communitarian identity as an independent sovereign state and their liberal democratic identity as a potential member of a world state. Trying to have it both ways works for now, but in the long run, I think it's an unstable equilibrium, and I think Americans will eventually choose their better half. Thank you.
I'd also like to extend my thanks to Hiram College, the Garfield Center, James Thompson, his director, to Alex Wendt for his very strong case for a world state. And I'd like to extend my thanks to my dear friend John Kortansky, founder of the Garfield Center. I was lucky enough to teach here at Hiram for a few semesters many years ago. There was no Garfield Center then. Thanks to the generosity of Bill Recker, there is now. But I did get to co-teach the Quest for Justice course with John. And as I told him a while back, everything I know about teaching, I learned from him that year. But it has since occurred to me that he hasn't told me everything he knows about teaching. This was confirmed for me a while back when I took a look at John's evaluations on ratemyprofessor.com. One in particular caught my eye. The most amazing thing I've ever read in an evaluation. Amongst all of the other superlatives, this stuck out. It said, "I want to marry John and have his babies." Hey, I have never received a comment that comes as anything close to that. And when I read it, I knew that John had been holding things back from me. But seeing John teach that one year with dazzling, witty, powerful introductions to great works, from Plato to Nietzsche, was terrific. If I might paraphrase what James Garfield himself once said, all that's really needed for a liberal education is a log with a student on one side and a great teacher on the other. John Kortansky is that kind of great teacher. Hiram has been richly blessed to have him these many years among its faculty, and I'm very proud to have him as my friend. John, I think it's long past time you stood up and took another bow. I want to begin my remarks today with a reminder of our good fortune in being citizens of the United States, which remains engaged in world affairs as a powerful, benign leader. Our nation's activities on the world stage sometimes evoke from our European friends the disdainful epithet cowboys, suggesting that our military campaigns are something we must and will outgrow, just as Europeans have outgrown their own barbaric past and now use soft power, which is something like pillows thrown at a pajama party. We sometimes foolishly neglect the sentiments and opinions, though, of our weaker and needier friends, like the Europeans or South Koreans, forgetting that they cannot but resent over time their position as the assisted, that it rankles to have American forces saving them year after year from their enemies, regardless of how farsighted or patient American hegemony might be. Our friends seek self-respect, and therefore they seek their own place in the sun, which, truth be told, we must soon grant them. This is something about which Dr. Wendt and I share some common ground. But while Dr. Wendt wishes them and us and everyone else to surrender to a world state, I'd prefer that our friends stand tall, like us, on their own 2 feet. I want to stress in any event that we Americans do not yet have direct experience of a world in which our activity in international affairs is no longer necessary or possible. We don't have experience of a world without states. And lacking that experience, we can the more easily be lured by the siren song of a world state. It's the harder to resist, inasmuch as many of us have been trained to hear it for a good part of our lives. A vast training establishment, from UNICEF boxes for 6-year-old trick-or-treaters to model UNs for undergraduates at American colleges, encourages us to be good world citizens, persuades us that it's correct to lend support and devotion to the United Nations, that harbinger of the world state. Much of this talk of world citizenship in higher education is, of course, merely window dressing. It tells administrators and faculty at other colleges that one's own college is hip and worthy of recognition rather than of a scolding for being reactionary. For scoldings are the alternative to recognition. But the world citizenship aspiration of colleges is, for all of that, quite real and telling. What, after all, or when was the last time that you saw its alternative proclaimed at a college or university? A college mission statement that claimed to make its students patriotic, to make them good American citizens. The love of your particular fatherland is now counted a sin on college campuses. It's mentioned only to be denounced as jingoistic, parochial, or the last refuge of scoundrels. To be an idealist is, we're told, to be committed to goals that culminate in a world state. But no serious person adheres to what's trendy just because it's trendy, nor does a self-respecting person bow to an opinion because it's held by elites. I invite you to question elite opinion here, to question the wisdom of those who are animated by hostility to the nation state, to that political form that has, after all, given us the means to equality and liberty, to liberal politics. I'll argue that to abandon the nation state in disgust and blame is a mistake, one that will lead us to a soulless despotism. Dr. Wendt is still claiming that the world state is inevitable. I think that empirical political science would refute this claim, but we're not here to discuss that argument. We're here to discuss whether it would be a good thing. Now, it is, of course, an empirically verifiable movement today. There is one on the world stage toward a certain type of world state under a new caliphate. That kind of world state is the dream of our enemies, the Islamicists. But Dr. Wendt imagines a secular world state with perhaps some regional representation and certainly a secular world court. He imagines the European Union writ large. Now, should there be such a world state? That is, should it be the object of our prayers and our efforts? I say, and I say emphatically, no. What are the reasons for my opposition? Let me start with what is at once the simplest and the deepest or most comprehensive. In June 1940, with France defeated by Hitler's forces, Winston Churchill faced the daunting task of preparing the English people for the Battle of Britain. in which, as he put it, the whole fury and might of the enemy, Hitler, would be turned upon them. On that occasion, Churchill made the following statement: "Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties. Let us so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will say, this was their finest hour." Ladies and gentlemen, should a world state come into being, there will be no more such finest hours. There will be no opportunity for such deeds, for answering the call of duty on behalf of your nation in a bracing battle with a dreadful enemy. That is indeed the meaning of the world state. No enemies and no friends. No deep hatreds, because no deep loves. Nothing to which one could devote oneself or to be prepared to sacrifice oneself. There's to be nothing to kill or die for. This is what Dr. Wendt, following John Lennon, wishes. The case for the world state is long-standing. And for just as long, it has elicited opposition and dread. It was seriously contemplated already by the late 18th century when Kant had to oppose it. Espying it from afar, that century's greatest minds were unsettled. Montesquieu, who more than anyone convinced the West of the desirability of homogenizing all human mores and laws through commerce, turning it into what Dr. Wendt called a large America. Montesquieu wrote with a visible sadness about the result. He looked back to the small Greek and Roman republics and their virtue with admiration. When that virtue was in full force, he said, things were done in those governments that we no longer see and that astonish our small souls. Rousseau, otherwise the great opponent of Montesquieu, gave this sentiment of disgust with the commercially homogenized modern soul and the admiration for an ancient republic its fullest expression, so that by 1816, even Montesquieu's great student, Benjamin Constant, a great progressive proponent of modern liberty and homogeneity, was compelled to echo his teacher's sentiment even more loudly. One could not read the beautiful pages of antiquity, says Constant. One could not recall the actions of its great men without feeling an indefinable and special emotion, which nothing modern can possibly arouse. The old elements of a nature, one could almost say earlier than our own, seem to awaken in us in the face of these memories. It is difficult not to regret the loss of a time when the faculties of man developed in so wide a career, so strong in their powers, with such a feeling of energy and dignity. Once we abandon ourselves to this regret, it is impossible not to wish to emulate what we regret. But the deepest expressions of anguish at diminishing human greatness in the coming world state were those of Friedrich Nietzsche, whose unforgettable description of the last man must haunt the heart of anyone who cannot rest content with egalitarian sneering, resentments, and entertainments. Nietzsche attributed the desire for mutual recognition to the slave morality. By this attribution, he hoped to question equality as not universally just, but instead the created value of a cunning, resentful will to power, one that threatens to enervate and destroy deep human longing. He opposed the modern philosophic political project that had resulted in capitalist democracy on one hand and communism on the other. That project, precisely as a progressive project, still poses a very great danger to which the academic left is constitutionally blind. I shall call that danger progressivism's forgetting of humanity. Progressivism is a product of modern political philosophy. Hegel makes the strongest argument for it, of which I'm aware, and Dr. Wendt wisely chooses to revert to Hegel's argument. Let me say a word about it. Hegel's philosophy of history is the mother of all Western meta-narratives, chronicling and explaining the triumph of rational self-consciousness over more primitive human consciousness. Hegel presents the desire for recognition as moving a long, historical, dialectical relation with the other. I want to stress that for Hegel, the doctrine of recognition is non-transcendent. That is, it offers an atheistic account of what had hitherto been understood as a desire for transcendent or divine meaning in human life. Through history, Hegel argued, we come finally to realize that there's nothing looming above the human that calls us to transcend the human, but instead only mutual reciprocal recognition, grasped in intersubjective certainty. Now, in 1806, Hegel was able, sincerely, after the Battle of Jena, to reinterpret, as if he were a fully rational and self-conscious mortal God, the literature and thought and political life of every previous, more or less primitive, historical culture or society. Hegel could say, in effect, yes, that's what these and these poets, thinkers, philosophers, artisans, and political actors have said, but we, whose consciousness has progressed, we can see that they said it within the limiting horizon of their time. Their consciousness was backward, not fully developed. We know now what they were really aiming at, what they would have said had they been born and lived at the end of the human drama, as we do. Hegelian thought exercises in this way a paternalistic despotism over the thought of the past. It prohibits it from disclosing itself as it is. It pretends to understand past thinkers and actors better than they understood themselves. Contemporary Hegelians who study international relations make the same despotic distortions, but this time of the thoughts and words of humans living in the present, of humans who see Hegelian modernity firsthand and who reject it. I refer to what IR Hegelians like Halim say about Islamicists. They see and hear only, quote, the desire for recognition in every and any statement and act of Islamicists. And so they must explain away every clear Islamicist argument against democracy, against freedom, against modernity. Even Abu Musab al-Zakari's speeches against democracy are magically transformed in this way into statements about the autonomy of the self or identity formation, achieved through mutual reciprocal recognition. Such despotism of interpretation may be fit grist for Monty Python's mill. It's not cheese workers, it's dairy workers and workers in general. But it's a dangerous distortion that no student of international relations should accept. But these are by no means the only ways in which Hegelian progressivism has shown itself to be despotic. I'm compelled to remind you that certain left-wing Hegelians, called Marxists, had as their goal a world state, or what amounts to the same thing, a stateless world society. Marxists aimed to build, quote, the new man in the Soviet Union. The result was, among other horrors, the execution of tens of millions of human beings on purely political grounds. Progressives like to tell themselves that this gruesome, progressive Marxist tyranny was Russian, that Stalin was just a throwback to Ivan the Terrible. But then what of Mao Zedong and his murderous, progressive Marxist tyranny in China? Millions were put to death, dying in re-education camps during the Great Leap Forward, and millions more in that putrid unleashing of fanatical, deracinated progressive youth called the Cultural Revolution. Then there's Pol Pot, another Marxist progressive genocidal killer. And these are only the most famous. Hegelian progressives would prefer that you ignore the pattern of progressivist political despotism that they have established. During the Cold War, in fact, progressive Sovietologists routinely lied about them. Jerry Huff of Princeton falsely declared in 1983, for example, that only 10,000 people had been put to death at Stalin's orders. Still, one could argue, weren't Stalinism and Maoism the sad aberrations of psychotic human beings rather than the result of progressive Marxism? That plea, unfortunately, cannot account for the fact that the Soviet Union continued long after Stalin to exercise an inhuman and monstrously dishonest tyranny. In truth, as Martin Malia has shown, Soviet totalitarian tyranny was caused by the Marxist doctrine of the progressive consciousness of humanity, and hence of the leading role of the Communist Party. This notion of superior historical consciousness, by which Marx himself dismissed his critics, has been employed by every Marxist regime that has ever come into existence to justify the brutal crushing of dissent as the product of, quote, backward consciousness. But, say the Hegelian proponents of the future world state, we'll have domestic checks and balances. We'll have institutions. This reply forgets that institutions are staffed by human beings and work well only with educated human beings. And here we begin to get to the heart of the problem. The world state cannot educate human beings. It may, to be sure, give us training programs, perhaps even good ones here and there. But training is not education. The guards at Auschwitz were well trained. A world state can give us very good, very efficient training, but it cannot provide the education that human beings need to live free lives. Why not? Why is the progressive world state bound ever to fail in this, and so to produce what Kant called soulless despotism? The short answer is that the world state stands against what is needed for the cultivation of the moral habits needed to be free human beings. Admiration and love of what's high or noble, so necessary to that cultivation, extends outward for the family, to the tribe and the city and the nation. Because it's only sacred traditions, wholeheartedly embraced and sternly upheld, that can form a heart ready to stand foursquare for justice, for moderation, prudence, and courage, rather than a heart fanatically devoted to an ideology. It's a national heritage ingrained through habit and custom, like an accent or dialect, that tones one's ear to the high call of honesty, generosity, discretion, generous wit, prudence, perseverance, reverence, deference to genuine superiority, and defiance of despotism. But progressives stand against tradition, which they would either cruelly burn or coldly place in a museum. So the progressive Hegelian Karl Marx speaks of the rescuing of whole populations from the idiocy of rural life, writes off his opponents by declaring their very ideas are but the outmoded product of their bourgeois modes of production, and speaks of religious faith as the equivalent of a snakeskin to be shed by an enlightened humanity. When progressives do condescend to address an opponent, it's most often to cluck, "Nobody believes that anymore." And as Nietzsche observes of the progressive last men, there's no end to their derision. Nietzsche's great student, Martin Heidegger, has supplied us with the deepest reasons to feel uneasy about the prospect of the progressive's universal and homogeneous state. Permit me to sketch very crudely the most salient aspects of Heidegger's far-reaching questioning of the attempt to remake the given world that culminates in the cosmopolitan world state. Heidegger argues that this attempt has been dehumanizing because it has deprived us of the deepest experiences of our souls by closing us off from what is venerable in human life, around which all else in our existence revolves. These venerable things consist of devotional obligations, virtues, things of beauty and nobility, gods, model individuals, and thick communal ways of life that are the ever-diverse manifestations of an elusive being. In its diverse manifestations, this being, with a capital B, allows merely existing entities to become meaningful, and it does that by evoking our reverence and love. But then the irresistibly moving experiences that he's referring to can be grasped only in or through experiences rooted in one or another sacred tradition, none of which is authoritative for others, and all of which are essentially in conflict, and which evoke conflict and struggle. Genuine human understanding, by this account, is not universal. It's not liberal or democratic. It's always perspectival. It's committed. It's engaged. It's this being embedded in a particular way of life that Heidegger says we must always strive to preserve. And it's emphatically not atheistic or secular, but it's devout. Now, this Heideggerian understanding sees the Hegelian claim of trans-historical detachment as something shallow, and sees reason's attempt to demand fixed or universal standards of justice, like reciprocal recognition, as corrosive of the deep, diverse faiths that support genuine and competing standards of justice and moral judgment. It views the world state's stress on tolerance and openness as symptomatic of a loss of devotion and dedication in life. The modern rationalism on which the Hegelian world state rests relentlessly reduces all things, including the human things, to what's common, homogeneous, completely American globalization. A cosmopolitan world state which attempts to orient human life by hopes for peace and agreement rooted in permanence and universality, prosperity, and an end of suffering through technological conquest of nature, that comes to sight now not as genuinely human, but instead as a flight from the fundamental experience that is the clue to being. And that experience is, according to Heidegger, awareness of our exposed mortality and the moral seriousness and resoluteness that comes with that awareness. The experience, therefore, stands in opposition to the progressive Hegelian rationalism that would bring about the world state. It stands opposed to the spiritually impoverished, atomized life that results from being guided by an ever-increasing litany of alleged universal individual rights or claims, and the procedural rationality that accompanies it. It calls, in short, for a renewed openness to the divine in its strange, uncanny manifestations. But perhaps Heidegger's a bit too rich, too Nordic for our American tastes. Perhaps he's merely, as Richard Rorty called him, a Schwarzwald redneck. So let me try to state the argument in a manner more immediately intelligible to us Americans. We govern ourselves as a people with a shared sense of the common good and of virtues that we admire in friends and neighbors, and that we would hope to inculcate in our children. Our nation and the education it affords us calls us to look up to admire, and to revere what's above us, that by which we order our devotions, our commitments, and our daily lives in their preparations, their labors, as well as their moments of leisure. There's no human substitute for that reverence or for the traditional virtues that it promotes. They are the bedrock of a healthy and vibrant national civilization. The qualities of soul manifest every day in the activities of its adult citizens who are taught to admire and emulate these virtues through distribution of honors and goods in accordance with what they deserve. Reverence for virtues and a corresponding deep contempt for vice, those are even the hallmarks of any healthy civilization. Or one may say that what characterizes such a civilization is the cultivation of the conscience, which causes the citizen to stand in fear and trembling of wrongdoing. The characteristics of the civilization of a world state would be quite different. It would not foster, because it fears, loyalty to any deeply held or unbending notions of virtue and vice, because such loyalty is at odds both with peace among peoples and with reciprocal recognition. The world state, because it will try to comprise many nations, must in truth wipe out their virtues in the name of that progressive vision of humanity in which it acts. It aims to destroy reverence for particular traditions in favor of a new collectivized humanity. The world state, therefore, does not increase our ability to govern ourselves, it diminishes it. This is nowhere more manifest today than in the European Union. Dr. Wendt points to the EU as if it were utterly unproblematic as a model for the world, as if Pierre Manin had not written devastating critiques of the EU from within and its attempted destruction of the kind of self-government that was once found among Europe's nation states. As Jacob Greigel has also recently reminded us, the EU is a project administered by a class dirigeante, a ruling class. It's government by regulation, often of the minutiae of daily life, one that's slowly restricting freedom of speech in the name of mutual reciprocal recognition. If the EU is any guide, I'm afraid the world state will be governed by bureaucrats eager to deprive us of self-government. From here, I think we can better understand Kant's argument in Perpetual Peace that the administration of the world state is indeed bound to become a despotism. It doesn't have to do with black helicopters. As Dr. Wendt has reminded us, Kant called famously for a federation of states, but Kant vigorously opposed the strengthening of that federation into a world state. In fact, he found the condition of independently existing neighboring states not in a league, that is, a condition that he called after Hobbes a state of nature. He found that preferable to a world state. A world state would, he argued, end, quote, in one universal monarchy and laws always lose in vigor what government gains in extent. Hence, a soulless despotism falls into anarchy after stifling the seeds of the good. Dr. Wendt slights this argument. He notes that Kant rejected a world state in part because of the technology of his day precluded it. But technology is no answer to the problem to which Kant points. Technology can increase communication across distances, sure. But communication does not produce community. The deepest objections that Kant raises to the world state are about the prospect of despotism through a people's loss of its self-rule, a prospect that would not be diminished but increased by technology. Let me go a little further. The soulless despotism to which Kant referred will use the chilling, value-free jargon of contemporary social science of the sort that Dr. Wendt is using. Once upon a time, political scientists spoke, just as citizens speak, of the political community meting out honors and punishments in accord with who deserves them. Dr. Wendt instead speaks as follows, and I'm going to quote from the article that he was quoting from. States are homeostatic systems that exert downward causation on their members. This causation disciplines people to stay within the boundary conditions of the state most of the time of their own accord, and authorizes violence by state agents when they don't. He speaks similarly of the state's suppression of destabilizing interactions at the micro level. That is the techno-speak of the future world state and its ruling class. But just what are these destabilizing interactions that the world state would have to suppress, even by violence? Ladies and gentlemen, we aren't just talking about crime or criminals. And we aren't just talking about the use of the wrong kinds of light bulbs or shower heads, though even decisions about those things will be made by world state elites without our input or consent. We're talking about actions and dispositions deemed non-politically correct, where the world state is not going to be like the old empires, which didn't care about subjects and so left them more or less alone, so long as they bowed when the emperor passed by. The world state will be a state whose very raison d'etre is the guaranteeing of human autonomy and mutual reciprocal recognition for the sake of the individual's identity and equal human rights. Such a state is a substitute for representative government. The recognition that the world state secures is going to be relegated by it to the status of a static formal principle, legislated not through an active expression in self-government by people, but merely by a distant ruling elite, though enforced by local gendarmes. This ruling elite must, to guarantee what Dr. Wendt calls identity formation, eventually seek to eliminate all thick communities, all genuine, robust communities of the type that claim to transcend the individual and that call the individual to vocations, that make noble demands upon him, like those once found in families and neighborhoods and parishes and villages and cities and modern nations. The ruling elite of the world state will promote instead what Dr. Wendt calls identity formation in transitory encounters of anonymous others. That's what we have to look forward to. The world state's progressive elite will move, as liberal states have already been moving, to eliminate thick communities by eliminating all discrimination in the private sphere as well as in the public sphere. It will, that is, slowly but necessarily cease to be liberal, cease to be free. To permit the construction of identities, it will have to declare the defining characteristic of liberalism, the distinction between the state and society, anachronistic and oppressive, because too permissive of disrespect of the individual. It will first recognize more and more protected groups, within society. And it will have laws proscribing hate crimes, that is, crimes whose motives are deemed worse than other motives because they entail a failure to reciprocally recognize the other. The world state will, that is, attempt to look into your soul. To secure mutual reciprocal recognition, its ruling elite will have to follow your every action. And with the advance of technology, the apparatuses that the world state will employ to peer into your private life will make the KGB and the Gestapo look like amateurs. And its scrutiny will be endless. Because the more a society approaches equality in all things, the more the very smallest inequalities rankle. Does this sound far-fetched? Glance around you. It's a development that's already proceeding apace in advanced democracies, where world citizenship is most loudly trumpeted. Great Britain prohibits any, quote, abusive or insulting words meant to stir up racial hatred. Canada outlaws, quote, any writing, sign, or visible representation that incites hatred against any identifiable group. A New Mexico Supreme Court decision last year stated that requiring a couple to relinquish their religious convictions was permissible as, quote, the price of citizenship. That will indeed be the price of citizenship in the world state, based on the principle of mutual reciprocal recognition. A loss of your freedom to think, to believe, to freely act in accord with anything other than what elite opinion tells you is correct. It will mean the end of the distinction between the state and society, and so the end of the liberal state. That is a price too high. Listen carefully to how the proponents of the progressive Hegelian world state speak. You'll hear modern psychological terms like the superego replace the term conscience. You'll hear of social construction of right and wrong, and hence of the needed removal of most injunctions to duty that carry with them a sense of guilt. In the name of the billions of autonomous individuals it serves and their opportunity to gratify their passions without oppression, the progressive world state will seek for its citizens liberation from guilt, just as it seeks an end to punishment, above all capital punishment, on the ground that it's no more than an expression of irrational vengeance. It will, to be sure, incarcerate and even subject to psychological retraining whoever opposes it. But it will do so as re-education of men suffering from various phobias and psychoses. Dr. Wendt, in any case, goes beyond even those who oppose the death penalty. He's opposed to the taking of human life, even in legitimate national self-defense. He suggests that the state descends to a primitive level of consciousness when it ceases to recognize the worth of other states and their citizens. He would have us protect the enemy of our citizens. He would ensure that soldiers will not any longer risk their lives for anything. While claiming to be the victory of the universal, of humanity, the Hegelian world state would in truth represent the victory of only a part of humanity. Equality is the watchword, and it is guided by a hatred of the rank ordering that characterizes any devotion to excellence or virtue. It would represent not genuinely universal morality, but instead the elimination of one side of humanity for the sake of another. Far from being rational, its new centralized order will reflect the deep-seated resentments of those who would crush the excellences that ever embarrass them. Its drift will be towards socialism, a world of enforced equality of production and consumption, and hence a world that affords little freedom for the individual to fail, or therefore to succeed. That is Dr. Wendt's position. He admits that human beings may recognize another as their superior, but he attributes that disposition to being, quote, poorly socialized. Actually, the opposite is the case, the belief in radical equality is the result of socializing. Admiration of actual superiority, including of one's own, if it comes to it, naturally trumps peace, especially if one belongs to what Lincoln called the tribe of the eagle. Let me just in closing now anticipate an objection to my concern that the Hegelian world state will bring us despotic, egalitarian homogeneity. Individuals and groups, Dr. Wendt tells us, seek recognition of difference, not sameness. Quote, groups entering into a larger collective identity want their difference recognized. Universalism depends on recognition of particularism, end quote. Dr. Wendt thus trumpets the right of difference. If you like your identity, you can keep your identity. But this is hardly credible. Any differences that remain in the world state will be about as significant as flavors of ice cream. Of course, we can easily welcome and combine and reconcile such differences, just as we can arrange window dressings and costumes for tourists. But if we're honest with ourselves, we have to grant that differences under a world state will be shadows of what had been vigorous ways of life, no longer the object of sacrifice and struggle. Such ways of life are precisely what the Hegelian historical dialectic has been busy negating. As Alexander Kojève reminds us, and Dr. Wendt relies on Kojève's interpretation of Hegel, universalism must begin with recognition not of particularism, but of sameness, of homogeneity. And that is only common sense. Mutual reciprocal recognition entails the abandonment of all particular devotional ways of life, which failed to grant the required recognition of the other. Each went to war with the other, rather than be directed by the other. Each must now die. The death of the old ways of life is to be carried out by rendering them into what Dr. Wendt calls group identities or cultures. Those are terms that usher in the world state's way of thinking. Identities, after all, result from the exercise of subjective freedom by an autonomous self, not from human beings enmeshed in communities. Identities are something that you construct as it suits you from whatever materials you choose. Identity privileges personal choice. To speak of identity is to imply that no way of life is better than another. It therefore cannot brook what in the past was called metanoia, conversion, or reorientation of one's soul by dint of a calling, a thoroughgoing change of mind. To convert is to say, I abandon my mistaken path for the right way. That is why the world state must stamp out the notion of conversion in favor of the notion of identity. By enjoining absolute respect for constructed identities, the proponents of the world state actually join hands, as Pierre Menard has pointed out, with religious fundamentalists who punish apostasy with death. I hope, in conclusion, that I haven't given the impression that the world state is an unrealistic dream. Like the hope for Marxist society of consumers and producers, the world state is an all too realistic nightmare. My hope is that some of you share my desire to stop this nightmare from unfolding, that you'll fight it civilly, but that you'll fight it with everything you've got, that you'll preserve for your future countrymen the very possibility of finest hours. That, today, is your great opportunity to make this your finest hour.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Wendt. Thank you, Dr. Burns. As you can all see, we have succeeded in bringing people who do not share every point of view. And we are going to open up to question and answer time. I know many of you are probably very eager to hear Professor Wendt's response. We don't have all that much time, and I know many of you have questions. So I think if it's all right for the moment, if we have your responses play themselves out in the question and answer,
absolutely.
and then at a certain point maybe have a more extended response if you'd like, or however that works. So if you would like to pose a question to one of our guests, please feel free to go to either one or the other of the microphones on either side of the room, and we'll just go from one side to the other. So we'll start over here, whoever is in that line, and then back there, and vice versa.
My name is Isaac Talmona. I'm a sophomore. And my question is, at the base of like globalization is politics, and in politics you need like the conservatives and the liberals, because both of them like keep each other like balanced. So like if you have like a global like enterprise of like nations, like how would that work? Like because you need those two sides to like keep each other from going to the extreme. So like how would that work with like a global enterprise?
Is this for me?
I think it's for either.
Well, I don't see any reason why, I mean, contrary to what Professor Burns has suggested, I don't see any reason why in a world state you would not still have tremendous disagreements about politics. You would still have conservatives and liberals. The one thing you would not have is people shooting each other about those disagreements. And I think that's what being part of a civilized polity is about, is that you don't use violence. But beyond that, presumably 10 billion people living in a world state would have plenty of things to argue about. So.
They would all be petty things, and they would all be things that they were permitted to disagree about. And I actually think that that the principles of the world state, at least if it's a Hegelian world state, if it's based on mutual reciprocal recognition, necessarily exclude. They have to exclude what I was calling all former vigorous ways of life. And those would be largely conservative, although it's a very large pot, those ways of life.
I didn't think you got my question. The question was, to every Russia, there should be like a United States. So like, to every United States trying to go to Syria, there's like a country like China and Russia saying the United States shouldn't go to Syria. But if you have like a conformed like group, if you have like the Russians, like all those from the Security Council into a global enterprise, then how does that work? I mean, not everybody's gonna make it into like the global enterprise. Not everyone's in the EU, in Europe. So like, how would that work for the outsiders? That's what I'm trying to say.
Well, I think on my view, in a world state, there would be some kind of centralized apparatus at the top. And so these decisions would have to get made the way democratic decisions get made within the United States today. So, whether it's majority rule or whatever it is. But so I guess I wouldn't see a world in which the US is acting independently and China's acting independently and so on. They wouldn't be able to act independently when it comes to the use of violence, because we don't do that domestically. There's no reason that principle shouldn't also apply globally.
I think you've raised a very good point, and allow me, if I could, to put it this way, that when there are many states, there's a possibility for dissent and dissenters to leave a state and to find refuge in another. In the world state, there's nowhere to go. What would happen to a Sakharov? What would happen to a Solzhenitsyn in the world state? We wouldn't hear about them.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ann Riddle. Thank you, Professor Burns, Professor Wendt, for coming to speak with us today. My question is actually more directed towards Professor Wendt, but I'd appreciate any commentary from Professor Burns. Bear with me, it's a little bit of a long setup. Professor Wendt, in your article, Why a World State is Inevitable, you state that people desire to be recognized not only for physical security, but also through recognition by another. That's how the self is constituted. You also say that those not fully recognized will struggle for recognition as best they can, which makes any social order founded on unequal recognition unstable in the long run. You continue by stating that the only way to secure fully stable recognition from the other is to reciprocate it, what you were talking about in your lecture. And unless that happens, in the long run, unequal recognition undermines systems that do not satisfy them. You take the argument of nationalism as a threat to globalization and turn it to use a support of your theory of inevitable globalization by explaining that nationalism is a product of people's desires to be recognized. My question is about how the recognition of Israel has caused serious tensions in the Middle East, resulting in conflicts with the surrounding countries and other countries. In that situation, recognition of a state, of a group of people, produced significant problems. From what I've seen, even though attempts have been made, it does not seem possible to me for the groups to reconcile. How does that affect your theory of recognition resolving problems of nationalism?
Well, I mean, Israel is a special case in a lot of ways. I mean, I guess when I'm thinking about nations recognizing each other, I think the European model is a better generalized model. But I think the case of Israel is instructive because there was no mutual recognition. And there still is, well, there is now more than there was, but it's still not complete, clearly. The Arabs have not recognized Israel's right to exist until relatively recently, and even there, some of the Arab population still does not. And Israel does not recognize the Palestinians in the way that when the Palestinians want to be recognized. So I think that's a struggle for recognition on both sides. And once that is sorted out, you'll have peace. But until it's sorted out, it's an unstable situation. So, I guess the larger story in the article is that nationalism actually, it tends to increase the number of units in the system because you get breakups of larger units like the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, where you didn't have sufficient mutual recognition. But then having broken the thing up into smaller groups, that actually makes for a more peaceful, more stable situation. So I think nationalism is part of the process. It's obviously very messy. It leads to a lot of conflict. In the case of the Mideast, the process is clearly not finished. But my prediction would be that eventually they'll have to sort it out, because what's the alternative?
I agree that it's a very special case and a difficult one. I think that the question, as you put it, though, brings out something significant about recognition and what Hegel means by recognition. When we recognize states, we're recognizing their right to exist as what they claim to be. And that's sort of the basic, fundamental form of recognition. That's not what mutual reciprocal recognition means. The latter, means recognition of equal dignity. There's a certain charade that goes on in international relations that our State Department and every equivalent of it around the world participates in, and that is we recognize a nation or a state. We recognize them and their right to exist as if they're equals. Everybody knows that's not the case. Everybody knows that, for example, when India has a problem with China, it is not going to go to Chad. It's going to come to the United States, or it may go to Israel, its new best friend, precisely because there is something not just powerful, but also reliable about the United States. It's not going to go to France either.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Matthew Thompson. I'm a freshman. I had a question for Dr. Wendt. Dr. Burns had posed some great ideas about the individuality of cultures being kind of threatened by the idea of a world state. I just wanted to hear your side of, like, in turn, if it would cause problems in the future. Or so.
Well, that's in a way inviting a response to his whole talk, which could be a very long answer. But I guess the short answer would be it was hard to recognize my own view and my own argument in his characterization. I think his picture of what a world state would be is very different than my picture. Mine is a minimalist picture. It's really about the organization of violence. And his is a much more maximalist picture. I actually agree with him that if the picture he describes were to come true, that would be problematic, because I'm, to a large extent, a believer in a lot of communitarian principles. I'm not in favor of homogenizing all cultures and wiping out all differences and all that kind of stuff. So what I care about is that no community should have the right to use violence against other communities with no accountability. That's my fundamental bottom line. And that's, I think, what a world state would ultimately be about. And so I guess I don't envision, I don't think the states and communities would ever agree to the kind of world that Professor Burns has outlined. But if it did happen, that I would agree that would be problematic.
Part of our disagreement is due to the fact that Dr. Wendt has introduced a few things today that weren't in the article from 10 years ago, which is what I had access to. But I don't think that that's simply the cause of the problem, because as you heard Dr. Wendt saying in his talk, democratic and liberal values forbid anything but the world state. And democratic and liberal values ought to be followed because the world is becoming liberal and democratic, that is American. That's homogenization. That's what I was talking about. That is the death of particular ways of life. Likewise, to say, my basic fundamental position is that you can't kill anybody. That is not the position of most human beings in most of human history. It requires, if everybody accepts that position, you are accepting a liberal, in the classic sense, democratic position. And if you're going to have a world state that accepts that as its fundamental principle, you are going to have a world state that is homogeneous.
Thank you.
Well, let's keep going,
Okay.
yes.
Hi, my name is Jacob Vaughn. I'm a sophomore at Hiram College. I had a question directed to you, Dr. Wendt, but you can jump into Dr. Burns. Dr. Wendt, you stated that a world state will come about voluntarily and freely rather than by force. Can you give us a rough timeline on when a world state might be possible? And do you foresee any potential problems in the beginning stages of a world state?
Timeline, no. I have no idea. It's very hard to make predictions, especially about the future. I guess, my personal guess is 100 to 200 years. I think that the speed of integration globally is intensifying greatly with technology, the internet, and everything else. But so, I don't know how long. I mean, part of what started part of what inspired that article, though, sort of the autobiography of it, is that I actually literally one morning sort of woke up and had the thought, in 1,000 years it's inconceivable that we would still have an anarchy. It just seemed inconceivable that we would still be where we're at today 1,000 years from now. And so I sort of worked backwards from there and said, well, if we're not going to have an anarchy in 1,000 years, then how are we going to get to wherever we're going to be? Now, in terms of sources of resistance, the biggest source of resistance, I think, is going to be the United States and other great powers. They have the most to lose. And part of that resistance will come from those who take a sort of a communitarian perspective, like Professor Burns has done, because of the fear that it's going to be homogenizing. I guess, to my mind, if the world becomes America, I don't see that as homogenizing, because really, what is the alternative to becoming America? Remaining non-democratic, non-liberal? Those ideologies seem to have less and less cachet these days, and my guess is that the tendency of history is to eliminate the competitors to those ideologies. So if alternative ideologies were attractive, then becoming America would be homogenizing in a bad way. I guess I don't see what the alternative would be from a normative standpoint. So.
74 years, 6 months, and 5 days. No more. This is a very interesting reply, because the claim that it is not homogenizing is made on the basis of the fact that there's no alternative. That's not a logical argument. It can still be homogenizing, even if there's no alternative.
Can I just quickly respond?
Please.
I guess when I look at America today, I don't see a homogeneous society. I see a society where there's fundamental agreement on certain basic things, that we're going to be a democracy, we're going to be liberal, we're going to have market economies, and beyond that, this is an incredibly diverse place. And my guess is that if the world were liberal and democratic, it would be even more diverse than this place is. So, yes, it is homogenizing in the sense that there would be consensus on certain fundamental principles, and in particular on the organization of violence. Beyond that, I don't think it requires that we're all going to be politically correct.
Shall I rejoin?
Thank you.
I actually think that's a very short historical view. That if you took a longer historical view, you'd see how radically different ways of life have been. And you began with a 50,000-year history, so it might be advisable to look at those many, many different ways of life. American way of life is astoundingly homogeneous in comparison to those ways of life.
I
And
agree
it's
with that.
becoming
That's
more
certainly true. That's certainly true.
This question is more directed towards Professor Wendt, but Professor Thompson can probably help me with the name of the author because I'm blanking on him. But he wrote before World War I that the European states were so economically integrated and interdependent that they would never go to war and it would never make sense to go to war. So I was just wondering, and obviously they went in 2 world wars and the Cold War. So I was wondering if, Professor Wendt, if you think that was true, and then what your rebuttal would be to him.
Yeah, this is and I'm actually drawing a blank on the name now too. Angel, Norman Angel, right, okay. This is a famous argument, and realists in the international relations field routinely point out that he made this prediction, and clearly these states were interdependent, and that didn't produce peace. And I guess my response would be that interdependence today is very different than interdependence back then. Back then it was mostly about trade. Now you have tremendous capital flows, you have the internet. It's just a much deeper kind of economic interdependence. So I'm skeptical that states that are highly interdependent in an economic sense today would go to war. But I don't want to hinge my entire argument on that. I think the democratic peace is part of the story. I think international law is part of the story. So that's just sort of one leg in the argument, in a sense. But I do think the world of today is a lot different than it was in 1913, in part because it's a democratic world and it's a globalized capitalist world.
No.
Hi, thank you for coming out. My name is John Hall. Professor Burns, I'm going to kind of piggyback off of one of your ideas and direct it at Professor Wendt, and then you can respond to him if you'd like. Within the liberalist world state that you see, Professor Wendt, coming, would there still be deep hatreds or deep loves like Professor Burns talked about? And would organized violence ever have to step in if there was these deep hatreds?
Well, are there deep hatreds in the United States? Yes, I would say. Sometimes those deep hatreds spill into violence, and under those conditions, when that happens, I think most Americans would say it's justified for the police to do something about it. Now, we had a civil war, and whether you think that the North's fighting the secession was justified or not, the North won, and now I think we deal with deep hatreds nonviolently. And I think that's hard to argue against, at least in my blinkered worldview, I guess. In terms of deep loves, do we have deep loves in the United States? Certainly. We have love for America, and we have love for lots of other things too. So the kind of love that I am worried about and motivates the larger argument is the kind of love that translates into a willingness to kill foreigners. Now, if they're trying to attack you, that's one thing. Self-defense is totally justified. But remember, a premise of my normative argument is we've already achieved a cosmopolitan peace. So the Canadians aren't going to be trying to attack us. And so given that, why do we retain that violence, that right to use violence? And so it's the kind of patriotism patriotism is great as long as it's not associated with retaining the right to kill foreigners, I guess.
Okay. I guess we've got a decision that we have to make, not just about the time, but I mean more broadly. We have a decision to make about whether we want to have a world in which there are no deep hatreds, for the sake of peace, for the sake of nonviolence. Because you can't have that kind of world without deep loves. Those loves will necessarily lead to that. They don't lead to indifference. So if you have in the beautiful presentation, for example, that Shakespeare gives us of Mark Antony when he's confronting the killers of Julius Caesar. He has to pause 2 or 3 times because he's choked up, even though he's supposed to be reconciling with these friends. And then say, "Oh, pardon me, oh bleeding piece of earth, stag of the world, heart of the world, that I should be friends with your enemies." It's not possible to be friends with your enemies. And we could have no enemies, but as I say, the cost of that is having no friends.
Hello, my name is Elle Rochford. Thank you both for coming out. Professor Burns had brought up Marxism and drawn several parallels to your world state, and I was wondering if you could respond to that.
That was part of what I was getting at in saying that I don't recognize my argument in his characterization. But again, he was correct to point out that he didn't have access to my talk in doing his talk. I mean, the cheap response would be to say, well, Heidegger was a Nazi, right? So, but that's irrelevant, I think. And so I guess, to my mind, the fact that Marxists have this progressivist view, I'm not a Marxist. The kind of world state they were trying to create was unrealistic. It obviously was an historical failure, and it's not what I'm talking about. I guess what I'm talking about are American principles, the principles of liberalism, the principles of democracy, but those principles entail a world state. So the Marxism stuff I don't view as really germane to the argument, I guess.
I brought up the Marxism because it's a case of left-wing Hegelianism, and because Professor Wendt, though he's not a Marxist, did base his argument on Hegel. And on the principle of mutual reciprocal recognition. My claim was not that his is a Marxist position. My claim was that Marxism gives us one more example of the failure of progressivism, that there's something about it that leads to despotism. And it's a paradox, because those who are progressive argue consistently in favor of freedom. But there's a problem with the argument of progressivism. And Professor Wendt did use the term consciousness in his article, and that's the key. It was the key with Marx, and it's the key with Hegel, that advanced consciousness, which is what he would like you all to have, presumably.
That's true.
Adopting the principles of liberal democracy. That is the core of the problem that I was trying to articulate. I hope I'm sorry if I gave the impression that I was saying Dr. Wendt is a Marxist. My claim was rather Marxism is an example of Hegelian progressivism.
Try to say one thing in response. But I assume that you and I agree that liberalism is a good thing and that democracy is a good thing, and that America should be organized on liberal democratic grounds, liberal in the classical sense.
Yes, we do, although I probably see it as more problematic than you do. I think that particularly when you use terms like identity and identity formation, that's not classic liberalism anymore. That represents, I think, a dramatic change from the anthropology of classical liberalism. It represents constructivism.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is substantially different and I would say highly problematic.
Okay, I know we're getting close to time, but we'll take 1 or 2 more questions, and then if you didn't get to a question at this session, if you are on the ticket for the dinner portion, then we'll have plenty of time to talk further. So maybe 1 or 2 more questions now.
Hello, my name is David Platt. This is a question for Professor Wendt. So my question is, what prevents the formation of several of a multipolar world in which several blocks recognize each other's right to exist and recognize and give up the right to use violence against those parties in certain areas, yet retain the right to use violence in other areas?
To retain the right to use violence between
Recognize-
them, between the blocks?
Between the two blocks, yet in certain areas.
Well, I think that that may actually be a way station on the way to a world state. You may get, sort of continental groupings of some kind. I'm not sure why that would be desirable or a stable outcome. It seems to me that interstate war is becoming increasingly impossible, and as technology advances, it's going to be even more so. So I don't see that as either a stable outcome in an empirical sense, and from a normative standpoint, that doesn't strike me as very attractive either, for the same reasons, in a sense, that I was trying to argue for the 190 state case. Why should anybody have the right to use violence unaccountably? That's sort of the key thing.
I guess I was more trying to get at why that would remain unstable if the states recognize and relinquish their rights to use violence against those other states directly, but perhaps continue to compete with them through other proxies.
Well, but wouldn't that be, if the blocs relinquish their right to use violence, then they're in effect giving sovereignty over violence to something else, I guess, and that would have to be a world state. So I guess maybe it's a matter of semantics here, but.
Hi, I'm James Louise, junior at Hiram College. My question is related to rationale and irrationale. For one, like one person's rationality is another person's irrationale. For instance, as when you spoke at the beginning of your introduction, you talked about war with China is irrational. Well, according to John Mearsheimer, it is rational. He believes that it's inevitable, in fact. And so that goes into human nature. So I believe in everybody has a drive for power. And so if you believe in power, then that would lead to hegemony. So then hegemony would go into recognition, which goes into Hegel, as you were speaking of recognition. So if somebody wants to go for hegemony, they're going to go for the recognition of power. And how would you say the variable human nature would play into globalization?
Well, John Mearsheimer was my colleague for 5 years. He was actually one of my favorite colleagues in my department at Chicago when I was there. He's a wonderful teacher and a very provocative scholar. Naturally, we disagreed about everything imaginable when it comes to IR, but that didn't stop us from being on the same side in department politics most of the time, actually. So, I guess if China drives for hegemony, it'll be blocked by the United States, and you'll have balancing behavior. Is war between the United States and China inevitable? If there is a war, it'll be ruinous for both sides. And I guess I'm a believer that rationality in the end will trump. Historically, that might not be the case. And I guess with respect to the human nature side of this, human nature is all things. It's the capacity to hate and to kill, and it's the capacity to love and be loyal. And which side of human nature gets brought out depends on the institutions, on the context, and everything else. And I'm an optimist. I'm from Minnesota, so I'm an optimist. It's in the blood. And I think that human beings can design the rules of the game in such a way that we bring out our better side and push back the worst side. But if war between the U.S. and China does happen, that's going to, in my argument, be one nasty step on the way to a world state. It might be sort of a global memory that might actually help bring about a world state after the war is over. But
also on my point, I'm referring to as in the fact that America is already like a regional hegemon, and there's technically only one regional hegemon that John Mearsheimer quotes. And so in that aspect, if you have one regional hegemon, what is the chances of they are going to give up that power in the aspects of still fighting for recognition?
Well, he does envision a world of different regional hegemons. I guess my view is that the United States is more than just a regional hegemon. We have something like 1,000 bases worldwide, if you include the so-called lily pads, the really tiny bases. So we are, in the view of some people on the left and the right, we're an empire, and not just a global empire. I think China and the U.S. are going to be struggling now for quite some time to accommodate their rise, and they're going to be seeking status that they haven't had in the past, and the U.S. is going to have to sort of bend with that. Does that mean we go to war with them? That seems crazy to me. I mean, but one could imagine a war over something like Taiwan. I mean, a war could happen accidentally, in effect. I don't see it as something that either side would plan, the way that Hitler planned World War II.
Yeah.
I'll just add a little bit to your initial question, which had to do with rationality. I actually think that Dr. Wendt's position is much richer than Mearsheimer's, and for that reason, worth arguing with. I don't think that Mearsheimer has a sufficient grasp of human beings to argue that, I mean, it's a very impoverished understanding of human beings. It's a Hobbesian understanding, fundamentally, and that means something quite artificial, constructed. And it's infinitely better to have an argument from somebody who actually understands that there's more to human beings than a desire for power. That there is a moral side to us as well as a thinking, thoughtful side. That goes into what we're calling human rationality.
Thank you.
All right, thank you all for your questions, and I hope you'll join me now in thanking our two guests for a very stimulating conversation. As is our tendency in the Garfield program, we're now going to retire to drinks over in the ballroom. You're free to join us, and then if you have a reservation, please stay for the dinner, after which we'll have further opportunity to discuss this topic with our guests. So we look forward to seeing you around.